and welcome to day 3 of this conference on digital finance and sustainability, which is jointly organized by the ADBI and the Sim Kee Boon Institute for Financial Economics at SMU in Singapore. So today we will have a joint keynote speech, which will be delivered by Randall Duran and Peter Tierney. I will introduce them in a bit more detail later. We will then have the final paper session, which will be chaired by Keiko Mitsuguchi, who's an ESG economist here at the ADBI. So the session overall today will run for around 3.5 hours. The keynote speech will last for around 30 minutes, and then we will have the session after that. So let's now directly start with the joint keynote speech. As I said, we have 2 speakers today, so we're looking forward to hearing what they have to say. The first part of the speech will be delivered by Randall E. Duran, who's a senior lecturer of information systems at SMU and former chairman and CEO of Catena Technologies at Singapore. And he will be joined by Peter Tierney, who's founder of Sackwish Partners in Singapore. And they will be talking about fintech data infrastructure for sustainable digital finance. The speech will last for 20 minutes, and then we will have 10 minutes for Q&A. So I'll now hand the floor to Randall to please go ahead.
So thank you and welcome to our session today. As background, I'd just like to kind of start out and highlight in terms of our paper, really we're looking at disclosure and reporting for sustainability being at a very early stage of development, where it's come out of the global warming crisis and other concerns around ESG, which has prompted opportunities for green finance. And related to that, we've started to see issues with data availability and quality for being able to measure the effectiveness of green finance activities. And in turn, there's an opportunity for green fintech to help address these particular issues. The approach we've taken is really to look back at another financial reporting requirement that came up over the past decade, which is related to derivatives trade reporting. And this came out of the global financial crisis. So again, it's something that's been a critical factor over the past several years. And our approach is effectively to try and identify areas where we have existing data infrastructure in context specifically of the global trade reporting that we can apply to sustainability reporting going forward as well. And the structure of how we're going to approach this is I'll start out by going through the aspects that are relevant for global trade reporting and take a look at the data architecture that came out of that. And then Peter will continue on and go through the aspects that are most relevant to sustainability, disclosure, and reporting. So global derivatives trade reporting was, as I mentioned, triggered by the global financial crisis, where we had financial institutions like Bear Stearns, AIG, and Lehman Brothers that either failed or almost failed as a result of their positions in these financial instruments. And these are a special type of derivatives, which are referred to as over-the-counter or OTC derivatives, which are traded bilaterally between the parties. And so they weren't going through exchanges or clearinghouses, and thus weren't reported initially to financial regulators. As a result, the financial regulators were caught off guard in terms of understanding the potential exposures that these financial institutions had. And following the global financial crisis, they came together, the G20 nations, and agreed to implement regulatory reporting for these bilateral OTC derivatives. And there was general agreement between the regulators across the various countries on the substance of the reporting, but there's quite a bit of variation in terms of the scope, in terms of which financial participants, banks, asset managers, and other entities would be required to report, as well as the specific financial instruments that needed to be reported on. So whether it was certain types of swaps, credit swaps, interest rate swaps, FX forwards, all of those varied between different countries. Likewise, the timing of when they had to be reported in terms of the timeline varied significantly between the countries, which we'll look at next. But maybe most importantly, the mechanism through which they would be reported, there was no standard set for that. So there was a clear requirement that this information had to be provided to the regulators, but there was no specific way that was indicated that that should happen. And again, if we take a look at the sustainability aspects of this, this happened over 12 years ago when this process began. And we're seeing similar sorts of things now with sustainability, where the regulators in different countries are just starting to come up to grips with what should be reported, and still the scope, the timing, and the mechanisms have yet to be determined. If we look at the timeline for global trade reporting for derivatives, we see that expand over quite a long period. So it started when it went into effect in certain countries in 2012, with Japan and the US sort of leading the charge, followed by Europe and a number of the Asian nations around 2014, and continued in many different forms and changes up until today. And even if we were to zoom in on a specific country, where Singapore is shown in 2014, in fact, that for the Singapore reporting, that spanned across 4 years. They had their own specific timeline for which entities had to report which financial instruments at what specific deadlines. So it was an ongoing process for the participants. It wasn't just a single event. And even it continues today, where the regulators came up with what they thought was going to be appropriate back in 2012 or 2014. But over the course of time, they realized there's other information that they wanted. So just this month, the US regulator, CFTC, launched their new reporting requirements for derivatives, which had required major changes for the industry. So all of these changes and requirements across different countries was fairly taxing on the financial institutions that had to do the reporting, which led to a number of changes in terms of the market infrastructure. And again, to put this in context of sustainability, we look at where we are today, we're probably at the very beginning of that timeline, where the regulators are still trying to figure out what should be disclosed. And again, the timeline isn't clear. And we're likely to see a lot of variation between the different countries as well. So this sort of timeline projection wouldn't be surprising to see for sustainability disclosure and reporting as well. In terms of the market environment, there were a few major evolutions that occurred. The first was the formation of data utilities. And these were referred to in the industry as trade repositories, where the financial institutions that had to report, as well as the regulators, realized that they didn't have a mechanism themselves for doing this reporting effectively. And so they commissioned other entities in the market that provided utility services, things like stock exchanges or exchanges and clearinghouses, to provide services to collect and manage and analyze the data that was reported. For the firms themselves that had to do reporting, initially there was quite a bit of confusion about the variation between requirements in countries. There was a struggle to meet the deadlines, a number of different deadlines that came up, and they were in fairly short timeframes, usually 1 to 2 years at most. And as a result, there were a lot of manual processes that were implemented, just because there was no time to automate them. And tactical solutions were sometimes built in the form of IT systems. And these turned out to be quite costly to maintain and enhance over the long timeline that we saw as new requirements came up and had to be addressed. And ultimately, what we saw was fintech come into the picture, and regtech specifically, which is the regulatory part of fintech, where there were solutions that were evolved to address some of these challenges that came up, and particularly for the smaller players who needed support because they didn't have the resources to implement it themselves. And again, if we relate this back to where we are with sustainability reporting, today there are no market utilities. The reporting firms, there's a bit of confusion about what they need to do and where they're going to get the data to do it. And so far, there's not a lot in the way of regtech solutions. And we believe fintech and regtech will be able to help address data availability and data quality issues that we're seeing today, as well as other ones. Now, if we look at the infrastructure, data infrastructure that came up as a result of this new market environment, we had our data producers, which were the firms themselves here on the left-hand side. We had our data consumers, which were the regulators, and to some extent the public. And then we had the fintech in the middle here, which is really, I talked about the data utilities, the trade repositories, which were managing and collecting the data. We had a little bit of subtech, which is supervisory technology firms supporting the regulators and their analysis of the data. But maybe the bigger change was around RegTech solutions, which helped particularly, again, the smaller banks and asset managers to be able to cost effectively do their trade reporting. And again, just in terms of the context of the author's background, so Peter was the CEO of the trade repository here in Singapore. I was CEO of a RegTech solutions provider here in Singapore, which helped firms report into the trade repositories. And again, where these trade repositories and RegTech solutions are drawn as a single box here, really there were multiple solutions there, where we probably had half a dozen trade repositories, one for each country, and a few in the larger countries, and we had maybe a dozen RegTech solutions in the space as well. At this point, I'll hand over to Peter. So Peter, why don't you go ahead?
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you, Randy. And I guess I would like to bring the discussion back to the sustainability topic and the data and the disclosure mechanisms that we see today. The gathering and the disclosing of sustainability data is not new. I think we all can trace this back to corporate social responsibility initiatives, the CSR initiatives we saw in the early 2000s, and it's been maturing and evolving over the 20 plus years since then. Obviously, very clear progress has been made, not least the migration from voluntary ESG reporting to mandatory disclosure. We see the use of existing scale channels like listing venues and exchanges and the commercial data vendors that enable faster evolution and the broader distribution of the data. There have also been multiple initiatives to standardize the data, including the definition of taxonomies, the science-based targets, and industry-specific material disclosure topics. More important, I guess, than any of these is the dramatic change we all see in public awareness and the interest and the support for sustainability initiatives over the last 4 or 5 years. If I move to the next slide, here we go. Yeah, the graphic that I'm showing here is a high-level flow of sustainability data, and it's represented as a supply chain working from left to right. You're starting with the corporate entity, disclosing their E, S, and G profile as part of the standard shareholder disclosures in our graphic that's been made through SGX and being picked up by commercial data vendors for aggregation and onward distribution. And while this represents significant progress, we see 3 major shortcomings here. The process suggests that the sustainability data story starts with the corporate entity, and the data itself is internal to that entity. The flows depicted here, they don't easily cater for non-listed entities or to specific projects within the entity. And probably most importantly, the lack of traceability and granularity for the data makes auditing difficult and inhibits more sophisticated use cases like financing a green project within a subsidiary of a corporate entity. In this diagram, we grayed out the current data flows and focused on the corporate entity. If we extend the diagram to the left of the corporate entity, we see a chain of data collection that eventually leads to the raw data producers, the energy companies, the water and the wastewater processors, and an array of sources and sensors of valuable environmental data. Exposing the end-to-end data supply chain in this way, I think, gets to the root of some of the challenges facing the consumers of today's sustainability data. Those guys shown in gray at the right of our diagram. Firstly, the quality and the comparability of the data that starts at the corporate entity is extremely low. The task of tracing and auditing that data from the right of our picture to the left of our picture is currently impossible. And achieving scale in this configuration is really difficult and slow. The standards that are needed to improve data quality will emerge slowly. The incentives for change are diluted and spread across the picture. And the overall rate of change relies heavily on that individual corporate entity we show in the middle of the picture. Now, this version of our graphic reorganizes all the players, the data producers and consumers from the previous chart, and introduces a new concept, a critical component, I guess, called a sustainable data repository. This is where we see clear parallels with the financial markets model that Randy introduced a few minutes ago. In the financial model, regulated entities were created to lead the aggregation of large amounts of this non-standard, raw, fundamental financial data. They applied standards and they leveraged technology at a scale that achieved the quality that the industry needed. This is our flows, and the data producers in our diagram on the left. They're not data companies. Their core competency and their business models that were developed for delivering utility services, energy and water, and they don't have the background or the experience for collecting and aggregating data. Just like in the financial industry model, the creation of an SDR requires public policy. It requires legal frameworks and economic incentives for the organized collection and more importantly, the sharing of important kind of valuable data. Most importantly, I think, is that the SDR in my picture here creates a platform for an ecosystem that Randy referred to earlier and we saw in the financial space. Innovative green fintech players can grow up around a standard data repository like in the diagram and begin delivering value to the different data producers and consumers across the supply chain. I guess, as Randy showed, the international response to the 2008 financial crisis created a precedent and indeed a model for addressing complex data collection rapidly, globally, and at scale. And while the financial industry initiative is ongoing, this massive data collection initiative was mobilized and was operational across the largest G20 countries, including Singapore, within 5 or 6 years of the financial crisis. So an enormous and impressive mobilization effort. And armed with this financial data experience, Randy and I set out to test just how we might apply the data repository construct to the issues we identified with sustainability data that's available today. And that brings us to our case study. We quickly realized that sustainability data at the level we're talking becomes industry specific. So we picked an industry, real estate, which has a significant impact on the underlying problem. We worked closely with a commercial real estate fund that is registered and regulated in Europe. The fund has more than 1 million square foot of commercial office space and tenants ranging from government departments to large recognizable multinational corporate brands. The fund was a willing partner for a few reasons. Firstly, inquiries for sustainability data from their tenants were increasing in terms of volume and specificity. The fund is EU regulated and will be included in EU's first mandatory sustainability finance disclosure next year. And lastly, the fund combines invested capital with traditional corporate financing, and they had a growing awareness of the potential for favorable finance terms for green finance for the projects that improved their ratings on sustainability topics. For the case study, we worked with the fund's sustainability manager to understand the effort and the gaps associated with compliance with one voluntary regime, FASB, and an approaching mandatory regime, the EU SFDR that I mentioned earlier. Both regimes, we discovered, had requirements specific to the property industry. For example, the data required by FASB for this industry sector is very mature, with 17 quantitative metrics and 4 qualitative metrics that needed to be discussed and explored.
About 3 minutes left, Peter. Thanks.
Great. The diagram maps here the approximate data flows we discovered and our observations. The fund has clearly identified sustainability as a key business differentiator and had already made good progress on energy-related data. The energy focus was delivering immediate financial benefits through better energy management, and also highlighted the complexity of integrating the landlord's sourced energy with diverse tenant-sourced energy. The effort to do a baseline assessment for SASB and for SFDR energy metrics was reasonably straightforward, and actual data was available for the majority of the topics they needed. We discovered that proxies and approximations were available and very acceptable for the non-energy topics, but the pace of improving the quality of these topics kind of rested 100% with our friends at the fund. And lastly, as technologists, Randy and I were looking at ways to automate this data collection task, and we quickly realized that the combination of non-standard collection and property industry requirements, it created a scale challenge that a third-party technology service provider would struggle to make a business case. So we're at our last slide, and here's our introduction of the application of a sustainability data repository applied to the collection and refinement of data for our property fund case study. Firstly, the standardization and the economies of scale are realized quickly on the collection of the data on the left with the utility, energy, water, and so on. Collected data is aggregated and calculated consistently, and it's shared centrally by the SDR according to defined protocols. For the consumer, on the right of the diagram, the standards and the concentration of data enable scale and the development of what we pointed at in the financial space, those technology solutions catering to the different consuming segments. We found and we believe that a properly regulated SDR model would dramatically accelerate the evolution of sustainability data in terms of both quality and consistency. A regulated SDR removes the reliance on the corporate entity and supports much higher levels of assurance and comparability in the data. And I think we've all discovered better end-to-end data. It will enable informed allocation of resources, and the hope is ultimately drive the outcomes, drive us faster to the outcomes we're seeking. I have two other points just before we conclude. We wanted to make sure to add. Firstly, we speak at length on the potential to leverage these financial industry data initiatives, and we recognize that all our discussion is focused on the environment factors in the ESG discussion. This is important, but in no way is meant to lessen the importance of making progress on the quality or the consistency of the F and the G factors and measuring and managing social governance factors. Secondly, and lastly, both Randy and I are technologists, and throughout this effort, as all technologists do, we were looking for opportunities to apply new and disruptive technologies to a complex problem. Interestingly, our consensus at this stage is that the policy points we recommend in the paper, the need for appropriate incentives, so combining policy with incentives, actually have to be the priority to solve this problem. In our opinion, established mature technology, so the likes of cloud and AI and ML, combined with existing structures like stock exchanges and regulated utilities and the corporate governance disciplines that they provide, they give all the necessary building blocks and actually all the necessary available talent and experience to make rapid progress on this initiative. So at that, I'll pause, and I really concludes the slide where part of the presentation. Randy, do you want to jump in, or how do you want to proceed?
Yeah, I think we're good. Maybe if we could move to Q&A. John?
Yes, thanks very much, Randall and Peter. Excellent presentation. I think you highlighted a number of the key challenges faced in this space at the moment, and also some solutions, of course. I would like to ask if there are questions from the audience. Please somehow indicate that you wish to ask a question, and I will allow you to speak. If there are no questions, I have two of my own. Okay, Dave, please go ahead.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Randy and Peter, for your presentation. I guess just to ask you to expand on some of those points that you were making about the importance, obviously, of the regulatory environment. If you can maybe more specifically, since your case study was a property firm that's in Europe, and you cited the European regulations in terms of disclosing, what is their feedback? What is the feedback you're getting from the European regulators on this idea of going more directly to those to sources and of the potential data, the creation of this data repository? What is, if you can give some flavor of those conversations that you're having with the European regulator, and then here in our region. Typically, these conversations are a bit more, in earlier stages here in Asia, relative to where things are in Europe. Is that the case? And also, again, can you give some flavor as to what the regulators in Asia are reacting to this type of analysis of yours? Thanks very much.
If I could add just another part to Dave's question, which would be, do you think that the solution that you're proposing on this SDR is going to be helpful in terms of navigating the inconsistencies that we see in RegTech across borders? Because this is obviously an important issue, as well as the speed to which innovation is taking place and how to regulate against that speed. I think there's still some inconsistency in terms of regulation across borders. So what's your view on that? Thank you.
Sure. Peter, do you want to take the first part and I'll take the second? Does that work?
Absolutely. David, we didn't speak directly to regulators. So first of all, we worked very closely with a property fund and read carefully on their behalf the regulations that were going to apply to them. We didn't have direct conversations with the regulator. The response from the fund was very, very positive. They looked at us as technologists and were very keen to see if we were going to bring some cool technology to this new regulatory task. They're property managers. They're not data managers, and they don't normally do this level of disclosure. So they were looking at us as technologists to see if we could quickly kind of wave an artificial intelligence wand and make it all go away. They were very pleased to see that they were on the right track in terms of studying the measurable topics that SASB and so on had published. But it became very obvious to both of us that the level of effort individually by each fund was enormous, and the price point. This fund, had a few dollars to spend on technology, but this was an ancillary function for their business, not their core business. So the scale factor just wasn't there. When each fund has to go and understand this, tackle this, wrestle it to the ground, gather the data, format the data, and send it to the regulator. So if each individual fund has to do the whole job from the left to the right, it's daunting, and the price points are low. So the scale factor is not there. The scale factor that we saw in the financial industry, where an innovative entrepreneurial provider jumps in with technology because they can see a thousand potential clients and a business case. We struggled to see that when we fully understood the challenge for this part of the industry. And we suspect the same challenge applies in other industry sectors. If there isn't some standardization at the raw data collection, it's very, very difficult for the growth of that ecosystem of technology. Randy, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, and I basically pick up where you left off there, where the infrastructure model that we talked about, really the SDRs and the trade repositories in the financial world, provided a much needed standard mechanism for providing firms to be able to report. And that reporting mechanism was actually fairly consistent across different jurisdictions as well. So they kind of used that same model for how you report the data into the trade repository, although exactly what you had to report varied from country to country. But that made it a lot easier for the firms that had to do the reporting, because they knew how to put it in. They just had to get that information together and figure out exactly what they should be putting in. And that, again, enabled, in terms of speeding things up as well, the big players were quite good at doing that themselves. But what we saw is the asset managers, the smaller banks, struggled because they didn't have the resources available. And that's where, again, the fintech came into place. And again, in terms of speeding things up, where you see the smaller players having, in the sustainability space, potentially struggling to be able to provide the information in a cost-effective manner. And in some cases where it's voluntary, they may not because it's just too much effort. Again, the standardization will help. And again, it will enable the green fintech to provide these services to the smaller entities to enable them to do that. And again, hopefully accelerate the overall model in terms of who can do this disclosure quickly.
And if I can just add to that, Randy, like what we describe in the repository space, it's a foundational component. It's probably not, it's very important, and it's tending towards a regulated monopoly. It's like a stock exchange or a clearinghouse. It won't be an aggressively commercial entity, in my opinion, but it creates a platform for aggressively commercial entrepreneurial. If you leave the whole job to an entrepreneurial company, there's a huge amount of investment needed just to get the thing off the ground. So this is a way for governments to step in and kind of create a float that lifts the industry, and then lots of other entrepreneurial players can create their value.
Okay, so thank you very much, Randall and Peter, for an excellent presentation. I think it perfectly set the scene for the final session that we have, which is looking around the issue of green fintech sustainability. So your speech was very relevant to that session, which is coming now. With that, again, thank you very much, Randall and Peter, and I will now hand the floor to Keiko Michiguchi, who is an ESG economist at ADBI, and she will be chair of session 3, which commences directly now. So Keiko, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction, John. We'll have 4th research paper presentation as the session 3 of the event, where we will focus on green fintech, environmental sustainability, and MSMEs. First, I would like to introduce the presenter of the paper 9, titled "Can Digital Finance Promote the Low Carbon Transition? Evidence from China." The presenter is Tomoki Fujii, who is Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Economics at the School of Economics, Singapore Management University. His research covers broadly applied areas of microeconomics, including development, education, environment, and health, among others. Tomoki, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Can you guys all see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let me begin. So this is a joint work with Xinge. To motivate this research, let me give you a little bit of background, even though I guess most of you are experts in this field. So as you know, digital finance has grown rapidly in recent years, and it's becoming an important factor for the economy, finance, energy, growing innovation, pollution reduction, among others. And digital finance can be expected to play an important role in low carbon transition as well. In particular, we argue that digital finance can support green innovation, which is a key driver for low carbon transition. Nevertheless, the impact of digital finance on low carbon transition is a topic that is currently quite underexplored. Therefore, we attempt to fill this research gap. In particular, we aim to answer the following 3 questions using Chinese data. Can digital finance influence the low carbon transition? Does digital finance affect low carbon transition through green innovation? And is the influence heterogeneous across locations or across levels of low carbon transition? So why did we choose China? Well, China is the 2nd largest economy and largest developing country in the world. And China is the largest carbon emitter in the world, accounting for 30% of the world's carbon emissions from fossil fuels and industry, but without accounting for land use change according to the global carbon atlas. Now, as you already know, China is highly urbanized. 63% of people are living in urban areas in 2020, and this trend of urbanization is still there. So, based on these observations, we use city as a unit of analysis, and cities are important for policy implementation in China. And in order to reach peak carbon emissions, what we do in the cities is important. And cities are important units globally as well, given that 70% of the emissions are coming from cities. So where was I? Oh, okay. So for green innovation data, I use China Research Data Service platform. And basically this covers, green patents granted and green patent applications in thousands. And we use certain control variables such as, industry structure, population density, and so forth from China Urban Statistical Yearbook. Okay, so we use Slack-based model of data envelopment analysis using 3 inputs of labor, capital, and energy, desired output, GDP as desired output, and carbon emissions as undesired output. So I don't have time to go through the methodology, but if this LCT is larger, then economy is more efficient. So based on these measures, you see that, on the right-hand side of high tension line is more efficient in both, both years. So I'm showing, 2011, sorry, on the left, and 2019 on the right. And this map is a picture for digital finance. So the baseline specification is the regression of low carbon transition index on digital finance and a few covariates. And as I said earlier, digital finance may be endogenous. Therefore, we try to address this endogeneity issue by instrument. And we use a type of shift share IV, although it slightly departs from the standard shift share IV. So for the shift component, we use a Chinese Digital Finance Index for each year, so the aggregate. So this is a shift, which is kind of standard. Share, we use an inverse spherical distance from Hangzhou. Why Hangzhou? Because it's the origin of digital finance as represented by Alipay. So the argument is that, Alipay started near Hangzhou, and then, the spread of digital finance was coming from, Hangzhou. So the areas in which, Alipay is intensively used spread from this area. Okay. So let me give you the results. So the column 1 is sort of the simplest specification, where low carbon transition index is regressed upon digital finance. And as you can see, it's positive significant. Column 2 is essentially the same as column 1, except that we include some covariates. Columns 3 to 5 disaggregate digital finance by coverage breadth, utilization depth, and digitalization level. And in column 6, we use CD, UD, and DL simultaneously. So what you can see from here is that digital finance significantly affects low carbon transition, and this seems to be coming from usage depth and digitalization level, but not coverage breadth. So this kind of makes sense because, even if there's a coverage. If it's not used, it doesn't really matter.
I guess we should wrap up. Probably sorry about the sound problem, but we should wrap up with the last page of the PowerPoint of the Tomoki-san. And then we will let us hear the feedback to the presentation. Now, the discussant is Kiyoshi Fujiwara, who is a professor and the dean of the Graduate School of Economics at Aichi Gakuin University, Japan. And he has over 30 years of the research experience in the fields of environmental economics and development economics, international economics, and public finance, social security system in such universities as Nao University, Konan University, and Osaka University of Economics. Kiyoshi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So thank you very much for inviting me this interesting seminar. So I make a comment on Gu-san and Fuji-san's paper. So my name is Fujikawa. So maybe I need to add some explanation on the contents of the paper, right?
Thank you.
It's better, right?
That was helpful. That'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so the paper is about the relation between digital finance and CO2 emissions based on the China's city-based micro database, right? So, well, China is known as a country where digital finance or the cashless payment is widespread, along with Korea in Asian countries. So, however, there must be a regional difference in the spread of digital finance since China is very large. So I guess that China is a very suitable country to consider the relation between spread of digital finance and the environmental load, CO2 emissions actually in this paper. Then I appreciate that I learned a lot from this paper, and I would like to express my respect to the authors to handle a bunch of data, a bunch of city data. So discussion one, I have 4 comments actually. The first one is, first impression is the model is reduced form. Reduced form means the model equation estimates a direct relation between digital finance and environmental loads, CO2 in this paper directly. However, readers may want to know what is the structure or mechanism behind the model equation. And that is to say, so he said digital finance can reduce the CO2 emissions, but how it can be done? Well, electricity demand may increase because of digital finance, but electricity demand or CO2 emissions because of electricity demand can offset the the CO2 increase. It can be offset by the digital finance. So how it can be like this? So in other words, unless the internal structure or mechanism is clear, so we cannot get the concrete or effective policy suggestions. That is my first expression. So second one is the evaluation of decarbonization of the city. So there are 2 ways of thinking about CO2 emissions. The first one is production-based. The second one is consumption-based CO2 emissions. If we set a focus only on the CO2 emission in the production side, a city that buys, for example, electricity from the outside or buys goods from the outside is environmentally friendly, actually. The low carbon index that the author used in this paper is like this. The numerator is XCI. This is input, right, of the production. And the denominator is output of the production. So actually Y is GDP and B is CO2 emissions. So I guess this indicator considers only production side. So how about the consumption side? I mean, this is one city, this city buys electricity from outside, goods buys from the domestic other region, and with delivery with the land transportation, and this city buys some goods or services from the overseas by using airplanes and ships. Then this city is low carbon emissions in his definition, but can we regard this city as low carbon city? This is my second impression on the definition of the index of low carbon. Discussion 3, comment 3 is the definition of the explained variable, that is the low carbon index. The definition of low carbon index is like this, as I mentioned. So this is rather difficult to understand. Y is GDP and B is CO2, right? So CO2 increases, low carbon index decreases is understandable. However, because GDP, Y, has the same sign, right? That's why, direction of the LCT moves when B increases or Y increases, the same. So that's why it is understandable or not understandable. So maybe the sign of GDP and CO2 should be different, or how to evaluate, how to measure should be different. So that's my second impression. So no, I'm sorry, the third impression. So additionally, so explanatory variable is not very clear. Digital finance is composed by 3 components: digital coverage and digital usage depth and digital digitalization. So maybe anyways, a digital explanation, the detailed explanation will be required here as well. And last one is based on his definition. So this definition is unit dependent. If the unit is different in each variables, the value would be also different. So that's why, anyway, the detailed explanation will be required here also. Another one is the policy implication 1 in his paper is like this. Cities should continue to promote the development of the digital finance and continue to improve all aspects of its development. I think that most of all readers may agree with this idea. However, most of readers may want to know how the city government can promote the government development of digital finance. In other words, everybody knows that the rainfall is important for plants, but how to get rainfall is difficult. That's my impression for all the policy implications that he posed. Thank you very much. That's my comment.
Well, thank you very much for insightful feedback. And then now I open the floor, and then also the presentation, Vision Profession, is really fascinating, but unfortunately we didn't really have a time to hear his voice well. Thank you very much. And now I open the floor to Q&A, and I have a question from to Fujii-san. We'll just could you type in your answer to the chat box?
I can call out the question if you want. So basically, I would like to get some more information on the digital finance index that's used in the paper, because that's obviously very important, given that the paper is focusing on the impact of digital finance. So for example, what is the share of credit within the index, and any further insights you could have on that measure? That's all.
So this is coming from a reference. Can you hear me now? No.
We can hear you. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about the sound problem earlier. I don't know why it didn't go that well. So this is coming from a separate paper done by others. So if you go back to the reference, you can see the definitions very clearly.
Okay.
So it's a composite index, and so as I said, the the original index was scaled to 0 to 100, which we normalized to 0 to 1. And this 0 to 100 comes from a variety of different indices. And we have an appendix that lists what kind of indices are here. But beyond that, we felt that giving details is just copy pasting what is written in this other.
Thank you very much. It's really like we really learn we want to learn more about Fuji's the presentation and all that. But thank you very much. We have a really good the sort of insights and then feedback. So let's move to the next paper. Paper 10.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you. You got it. So the problem. Thank you very much for your efforts and all that. Now let's move to the paper 10 titled Green Peer-to-Peer Lending, New Opportunities for Governmental Support and Regulation. The presenter is Dina Azagariev, who is a research fellow at ADBI. Before joining ADBI, July 2019, she worked as research fellow in the Energy Economics Division of Energy Studies Institute, National University of Singapore. Dina, the floor is yours for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Please let me present the research paper on green peer-to-peer lending. And the objective of this paper is to provide what are opportunities for governmental support and regulation for promoting green projects. The presentation is structured as following. So first I will give some terminology definition, introduction, then a few benefits, and then the main part, what government can do to support green peer-to-peer lending, and finalize with conclusions and policy recommendations. So what is green peer-to-peer lending? So here I was trying to give definition of green peer-to-peer lending. So this is similar to the usual peer-to-peer lending, with the main difference that all the payments, lending or investing exclusively for projects and activities that promote climate or other environmental projects. We also call them green projects. So it's not only renewable energy, it could be any project for climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, including renewable energy, green buildings, clean transport, biodiversity, land use, waste management, and so on. So why we need to talk about green peer-to-peer lending? You know that there is a great need for financing, for access to finance, for promoting green projects, right? Public funds are not enough for promoting renewable energy or other green projects, for meeting net zero carbon emission targets by the mid-century, about around 2050, 2060. So really mobilizing finance really important. So why not to look at fintech for what can this technology can give for promoting green projects. So here we provide two benefits of why look at green peer-to-peer lending. First of all, peer-to-peer lending provides more attractive interest rates for both borrowers and lenders. This is important because for lenders, that's for responsible investors, and also for borrowers, that's for green projects. And they are cost effective. Why? Because, for example, one example from UK, allowed to borrow over 5 billion Great British pounds and only 6 full-time employees. So usually when government provides, let's say, subsidized loans for green projects like renewable energy, government provides such loans through banks. Okay, so banks are necessary for serving loans, for serving customers, covering the cost of branch and so on. So of course, this cost is covered inside of the interest rate. So peer-to-peer lending could probably provide better interest rates due to the lower cost and higher efficiency. Due to this smaller cost and high efficiency of fintech and peer-to-peer lending platforms, this allows to serve even very small customers, customers with even with minimum funds and minimum period of lending. So why we need this? Because that will help us to mobilize more funds in green projects if we can cover not only big responsible investors but also small responsible investors, those who also who don't have such a big funds but also want to contribute to for greening the planet, for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Of course, there are risks and disadvantages of green peer-to-peer lending. Those are risks and disadvantages same as normal peer-to-peer lending. So green and non-green, they face the same risks and disadvantages. But of course, countries before planning activities for green peer-to-peer lending, if government wants to support, then they can plan how to minimize risks and disadvantages. Okay, now the main part of this paper is to provide several solutions how government can support green projects via green peer-to-peer lending. So if government decided, okay, this is interesting, we want to try to support green project via green peer-to-peer lending, here how we can do that, 3 ways. So first, government could actually lend some funds through peer-to-peer lending platforms. Because as before I said, government does this usually through banks, via subsidized loans via banks. But if they do it via peer-to-peer lending, the interest rate might be more attractive because of lower cost and higher efficiency of peer-to-peer lending. Second way, countries can provide actually support for green projects, and that will allow green peer-to-peer lending platforms to make it easy. It will be easier for green peer-to-peer lending platforms to attract funds for these projects, and also tax-free interest rate, income earned as interest through this green peer-to-peer lending platform could be potentially free from tax or lower tax rate for green, which funds were used for green projects. Now, for each proposal which I suggested, 3 solutions, I would like to provide 3 cases of how this actually done in other countries. So government can provide funds for lending through peer-to-peer platforms for green projects, and this is done by Australian government. They did it through peer-to-peer lending platform. Second solution about providing feed-in tariffs or other policy support for green projects. So in the UK, peer-to-peer lending platform launched the green energy income account and allowed automatically to invest in renewable energy projects which were eligible for feed-in tariffs in the UK. So this was very attractive while feed-in tariff existed. The third example of that government can provide tax-free tax exemption for some savings account. So this example of UK, when green peer-to-peer lending platform, customers also could open tax-exempt saving account. Usually such provided in the banks, and in banks, customers can actually open such tax-exempt saving account. But this was not provided in peer-to-peer lending. So this was possible for green peer-to-peer lending platform, and that could be used by other countries too. To finalize, please let me summarize the paper, provide conclusions and policy recommendations. So this paper is about green peer-to-peer lending. Many people heard about already about fintech, about peer-to-peer lending, but not so much known about green fintech or green peer-to-peer lending. So this paper provides some solutions how government can promote green projects via green peer-to-peer lending platforms. First, government can provide lending via peer-to-peer platforms, not only via banks. Next, providing support to green projects like feed-in tariffs, for example, can actually also support green peer-to-peer lending platforms if they're linked, and also to provide tax-free interest for green projects, for green peer-to-peer lending platforms. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed. I'm looking forward to hear questions and comments.
Now Dina's presentation was pre-recorded, and afterwards the co-author Lovely Hai would really participate in the Q&A session. And then now for the feedback, the discussant is Xu Tian, who is a senior economist at the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of ADB. Before joining ADB, she was an associate professor of finance at Fudan University in China. Her main working area is financial sector development and sustainable finance. Xu, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Keiko. Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay, thanks, Dina, for sharing this interesting paper. I would start my brief discussion to quickly summarize what she found. So basically, she was trying to discuss green peer-to-peer lending, and then she gives some definition. Okay, P2P solutions applied to environmentally friendly projects. And then she discussed some benefits of it, like lower transaction costs, and then also offers many investment opportunities to investors. And then she gives some policy advice. So, for example, how government can provide support to green P2Ps via tax rebates, subsidies, those kind of exercise. Actually, this is a very trendy topics, and then I personally see it has a lot of potential to further develop green finance via fintech solutions. I have generally several I would say more structure issues that Dina might be discuss a little bit further to guide the discussions. So the first one is about, it would be very useful to distinguish the discussion when you talk about P2P versus green P2P. So for example, when you mention the benefits, so for example, P2P will, is more attractive because it's actually lower the transaction costs. So it's benefit both the borrowers and the investors. P2P allows a small amount of investments. P2P actually allows flexible choices of multiple investment projects. So basically, I would suggest you don't use transparency for that one. It's not transparency. I think it's more like a diversification. So for this kind of benefits, it's more about P2P itself. So I would suggest you really emphasize where the edge or advantage of green P2P. So for example, rather than simply add a scope of the projects as green, it would be better to highlight where the P2P model might deliver extra value added or deliver to fix some market failures in green finance in general. And then this actually will give us a more thinking about, okay, why green P2P can be a very useful green finance instrument to contribute to green finance. So basically, the two specific comments I would like to advise on this, and it would be useful that you can talk about benefits and risk associated with P2P itself. And then you move to, okay, what is unique about green P2P? Will green P2P be safer compared to common P2P? So for example, green P2P might require more monitoring about the performance and then disclosure. So will that make it more attractive to common P2P? So I think this kind of thing would be useful when you discuss the benefits about P2P. And then of course, on the risk end, I think this is what is currently missing from the paper. I see that in the outline, you wanted to discuss some risks. but actually you didn't mention much during the in the paper. So I would suggest after you talk about benefits, before you talk about policies, it's better to show some risks associated with green P2P. So that is one. So you develop from P2P to green P2P and then differentiate between the two. So, okay, this is my first comments. The second one is when you're trying to argue green P2P is a very useful useful instrument for green finance, it will be also very important that you can see how green P2P actually supplement with other green finance instruments. One thing I can think of, I really believe it, is actually this digitalization and well, fintech. It itself offers a good potential to monitoring the performance, but actually is that where the green P2P is using this technology? So I think there is a differentiation between that. So basically, you talk about fintech itself, and then you highlight fintechs actually is particularly useful for small companies to reach to individuals. Well, this is true. I mean, this is widely known that there is more inclusive features of fintech. But when you really move to green, where I would see a key difference between conventional finance versus green finance is we need to ensure there is a reliable financial performance to be delivered. And then you know what, this really requires a lot of resources to monitoring and reporting related information and report the environmental performance to make sure that it is not greenwashing. How can P2P address these issues, especially when the targets is small companies and individuals? Do individuals have the capacity to monitor small business? Do small business have the capacity to do the reporting and monitoring of environmental performance? These are the key questions I suggest you discuss. So how green P2P can address these issues, because these issues is common to all green finance solutions. So it'd be very useful that you show, I mean, why a P2P model or green P2P models, and then some of these issues can be better addressed. I think that will really highlights the value of green P2P. But I do believe, I mean, if it is really small business versus individual investors, this can be a challenge. So you might wish to argue that is as a benefit, or you might wish to argue that as an obstacle. So depending on how you see it. But my personal view, this might be more obstacle for green P2P because it's really costly for small companies and individual investors to do the monitoring. So that's what I see. And then you might wish to emphasize again well, how digital solutions might function in the green fintech area to play the role of data collection and to gather information. I think that might add value on this. Third is about the policies. You mentioned some policies like tax rebates, subsidies, feed-in tariffs. And again, I would say these policies works to all green finance instruments. So I would suggest you try to differentiate. So when government target green P2P, what are the issues that governments needs to be aware? What are more special about green P2P relevant to common P2P, relevant to other green financial instruments? And then I think with this, only after you talk about the uniqueness of green P2P, so two benchmarks. one benchmark is common P2P, another benchmark is other green other thing. So I think only when you acknowledge the difference between these instruments, and then you can talk about, well, how governments can support green P2P. So one is green, one is P2P. And then what are the possible risks associated with this? That's why I suggest you talk about risks. So when you talk about the limits, and then that's where the government should step in to fix the limits. So for example, how to protect investors, how to make sure there is the greenwashing risk is mitigated. That is already a lot of issues. And then, I mean, a P2P more requires more monitoring. So I think it's better that you can differentiate when you talk about the policies. So far, you gave two very good examples, actually, Australia and UK. I think you hold a very neutral view to when you mention these case studies. Actually, I'm not aware of these cases before I read your paper. Very interesting. It would be very useful if you can. So, for example, I think in the UK case, Dina also mentioned they actually end up. They finished it. So it will be very useful to the readers like me to understand how effective it is. Is it a successful implementation? Is this should be replicated, or what can we learn from these cases? So that will give us more information about the policies to support green P2P. So that is basically my 2 cents to share with you. But in general, very interesting paper. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for your very insightful presentation, and also very really beneficial feedback for looking views. Now I would open the floor to Q&A, but it's great that news that Dina-san herself now here to join us. I was informed that it's reported that you won't be able to make it, but we're glad to have you here, right? Then Dina, what it's got a lot of good feedback. Your presentation is great, and there are a lot of great feedback to your presentation. Would you have could you share your thoughts to the feedbacks, risks, greenwashing, important disclosure, and then really spreading the good word to other regions possibly? You know, you got really brought up new good cases and all that, but what would your feedback to the respond to the feedback, right?
Keiko-san, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. And Grace, I really appreciate your detailed comments. The previous paper which you commented improved so much, like you gave very good comments. Some of them I thought, oh, hard to implement, but eventually I implemented. And then paper turned very good. I think it will be published soon. So this is second paper, you giving me such detailed comments. I think this is another paper will turn excellent, very good. If we be able to address all your comments, I'm sure it will turn very good. Yeah, I agree with all your comments. Every single word you said, I 100% agree. Some limitations I knew, but most of them actually you like opened eyes to me. Maybe because like when you read external paper, like and your expertise. So you found many things which need to be improved. Yeah, I took a notes, and I also will get your presentation slides. So me and Hai will very, very carefully follow. So what can we do? Yeah, I think all comments very helpful. Yeah, especially for the cases. Like, so I didn't say at the end like what government should do or not, like because there are risks and there are advantages. Yeah, you're right. So maybe we should say something like how to make it successful, how to remove risks, and give some like good recommendations. So do we recommend or we don't recommend this for government to check? You're right, because some instruments they become so popular, like green bonds, right? They appeared and then they become so popular, and then many countries using them because there are so many advantages. But with green fintech, it's like very little happening still.
There is a
so
reason.
It's not,
there is a reason.
Yeah. So I think we need to explain why it still doesn't go that spread. And of course, I would not recommend every country to do it immediately, because there are so many risks. And you said greenwashing, I didn't cover it. So for government, will be very upset if they provide funding, and then or any institution, if they provide funding and it goes to greenwashing, that's not good for responsible investors. I can only thank you. I will do my best to address all your comments. And hopefully, if we address all, I'm sure it will be very good paper. But if we cannot address all, it will be not good paper.
You will address. It will be good paper.
Well, thank you very much. It's really showing us the new the area we can work on, and in various ways. Thank you very much for your presentation, and the also feedback, and then I guess the other discussion or feedback. I just wanted the feedback. Do you have? Oh yes, John, question.
Yes, thanks very much, Dina, for excellent presentation, and Grace for excellent comments. So I would just like to ask Dina to expand a bit. It's not really in the paper, so I think for the revised version of the paper, it should expand a bit more on what the risks are to engaging in this peer-to-peer lending that you're describing in the paper, because it basically comes to the conclusion that this is a great thing. Whereas I think it would be important to balance it against the risks, not only the financial stability risk, but also operational risks for firms that would be engaged in this type of activity. So I don't know if you want to answer that now.
I can answer for that. This is a great question. The risk, I actually, because I started this paper before COVID, so all my papers before COVID, they have personal communication, meeting people. So that's advantage for when I started anything before COVID. So I actually talked to people who did these peer-to-peer companies from different countries. And what I find out that there are, for example, peer-to-peer companies from Japan. They don't have as much trouble as companies that say from Philippines, because when I talk to countries like developing countries, they said they have cases when people just run away with money, right? So there are huge risks, and they have very big challenges, right? But when I talk to peer-to-peer companies from Japan, looks like they are more confident and they don't have such issues like developing countries. So risks, yes, there are risks common for all peer-to-peer, both green, not green. And there are also risks specific for countries, like, of course, because financial system regulation in UK, Japan, very different from developing countries, right? So the risk also will depend by country. So I can make it specific for, let's say, developing Asia, not covering developed countries, which are like very strong financial system like that. So the risk depends on, I think, on the country as well, on financial system. Some countries started to regulate.
There are also different regulations in different countries, so there may be we're talking over each other with a lag. So there, anyway, that's I get the point. There are different regulations.
And I can cover, I think, the progress of regulation, because some countries, when fintech appeared, right, some countries started to try to regulate this to some degree, right? There is like not regulated at all, and then you regulate, but you cannot completely regulate it like a bank. Otherwise, peer-to-peer will turn same as bank, right? So there is a limit to how much you regulate it, because that's the advantage of peer-to-peer lending, because it's so flexible. So some countries progressed with regulation. So I think good to show also the tendency, like where does it go and where does it stop?
Okay, thank you very much. Back to Keiko.
Do other people have question? Any question? To Grace, I have a question. There's the regulation issue raised, and then depending on the country, probably economies, probably the regulation should be really sort of fit to the specific situation of each country. Do you have specific view about? I guess it's difficult to say this country, this economy, but do they have the thoughts about the sort of differentiating the regulation among countries in this area? Any hints?
The question is for me, right?
Question to Grace.
Yeah, I think, first of all, as John and Dina just mentioned, infrastructure is very important. So I would personally view peer-to-peer lending itself as a solution requires really mature investors, actually also the regulations as well as the platform itself, because it is really small to small. So in this way, actually consumer protection, or you call it investor protection, becomes very important to ensure the financial risk itself. And then on top of that, you add green. And then, as I just mentioned, actually to Dina, it can be very costly for both small investors and small business to monitoring the environmental performance. And then this actually will invite another layer of risk, which is more related to the greenwashing. So considering both, I think John mentioned it's more about the fundamental functioning of this model itself. It itself has a risk. And then on top of that, we have a green. So these are actually what I can see. These are one reason why green fintech is not quite there yet, because the market, even in the mainstream market, is still developing. And then the regulators are still learning how to gather reliable and transparency, I mean, in the green finance markets. And then it might not be that mature yet to extend that too fast to different areas. So I would say for this to use this green fintech, it really requires a strong capacity of the regulators to monitoring both the financial risk and then also the environmental related risk. And then it on top of that, it requires basic infrastructures in the market. You need to have a sound operating model already there. You have a good education among the investors. So it has to start with a relatively more mature market, or at least upper income emerging markets, not the poor markets where investors don't know what they are investing. They say, oh, this is a higher return, and then end up with, okay, the government just, the companies may not return their money. So there might be this kind of risk. So yeah, basically, I think Dina really needs to add some risk analysis to show that the downsides and then the limits, why it's not quite there. And then I would strongly suggest you expand the case study, which I say will add a lot of value.
Well, I guess still we have 3 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Great. Yeah, I will try to expand case studies. Yeah, and when I asked hi, my co-author, okay, let's revise this paper for this conference update, and surprisingly, he said, Dina, there are no updates. So the paper, how I wrote it a few years ago before COVID, nearly the same.
That's really very frontier.
Frontiering
at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are no new cases like what cases which I found that time. So since then, looks like, yeah, it really doesn't take. And so I got your message. We will explain. We cannot recommend it yet, but we can explain why it doesn't move forward, and maybe what could be done to move it, maybe. And looks like you see examples from developed countries. So I wouldn't recommend it to developing Asia, because the financial market is not that safe for peer-to-peer. Yeah, it's too much risk, too many risks. Yeah. That's very nice. Yeah, actually, I didn't know how to make my message, because lots of risks. But it's nice that you said, let's explain why it's not working.
as we thought.
Well, if you don't, anyone have additional questions, comments, thank you very much for very frontiering, insightful presentation and very insightful feedbacks and interaction, direct discussion. Thank you very much. So with this, I'd like to wrap up the paper 10 session on that. So now we will have a break, and let us convene again at 12 o'clock Tokyo time. Well, now we're back from the break and move to paper 11, titled Inclusive Digitalization, A Way Towards Sustainability and Shared Prosperity. The presenter is Trisha Bhattacharya, who is a research scholar at Virandora Bharati University, and she obtained her MS in economics from the Department of Economics, Calcutta University, Kolkata, India. Trisha, the floor is yours for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and namaskar from my side. Today, I will discuss inclusive digitalization, a way towards sustainability and shared prosperity. So we will discuss financial inclusion in a very different perspective. We'll elaborately discuss the importance, the effectiveness and impact of financial inclusion, especially for the vulnerable section of the society. I'm Trisha Bhattacharya, research scholar of Rabindranath University, Kolkata, India, and my co-author is Supriyo Das. He is assistant professor, Ashutosh College, Kolkata, India. Please go to the next slide. So to introduce the topic, as we all know that inclusive digitalization, the main aim of inclusive digitalization is to draw the vulnerable sections under the financial, under the formal financial system, so that they have the access of the card-related transaction facilities, online transaction facilities, NEFT in India like NEFT, RTGS banking facilities, money transfers, easy savings facilities. So these are basically financial inclusion through digital channel. And according to World Bank report and plethora of research article depicts that financial inclusion obviously as a growth is a growth promoting agent, and it reduces income inequality as well as alleviates poverty. These are also the Millennium Development Goal as defined under Sustainable Development Goal. So a broad range of financial services accessed and delivered through digital channels, where ICT, information communication technology, plays a very crucial role here. So according to several researchers, ICT have different channels through which it contributes not only to the economic growth, but it also improves efficiency, develops financial sectors, and also reduce transaction costs, increase trade, and obviously it is good for the employment and brings innovation and development. Let's go to the next slide. So banking sector being the most impacted from digital transformation plays a very crucial role in terms of advanced banking system. Obviously reduces the time, the branch visit time. It makes information easily available. Also, it can it brings in transparency and efficiency, so the customer base also can increase. But the question is that digital banking services are able to include the vulnerable sections or the financially excluded section of the society? So this is our question that will be discussed in the entire research. Next slide. ICT obviously has a positive impact on the finance industry, but we should obviously mention the contribution to the standard of living. A wide range of use of mobile phone, internet banking has made our daily day-to-day life. So it has a great, to a great extent, it improves our standard of living. So banking industry being part of the digital transaction plays a very crucial role in social and economic perspective of a nation. As we found in different Asian development blogs that Asia Financial Diaries program of different countries, both developed and developing, adapted financial product in such a way that can meet real life needs. So, and also in case of India, digital finance holds a huge portion of the population now using digital finance. But as per the World Bank report, nearly 50% of the people now using digital finance, or they have the mobile phone facilities. Next slide. Next slide. So, according to the McKinsey report, digital finance could increase GDP of emerging countries as much as 6% by 2025. And in case of India, e-payment system has shown a tremendous growth so far. But however, a major problem in India, 90% of the transactions are still cash-based. So people are not using that benchmark level of e-payment services. Next slide. So as so far we have discussed that various reports and data says that digitalized financial services are no doubt growth promoting, but is it inclusive in nature? Our question is that, is it inclusive in nature, or the policymakers are only concerned about the number, that means increase in the number of the debit card, credit card and all that. So inclusion is very much required, and the question remains whether DFS-led economic growth is inclusive or not. Next slide. So this is a holistic approach of looking at inclusion. At first, ICT caters, information communication caters to the economy through digital channels, and it first penetrates to the banking industry, then to the society by including financially excluded section under the umbrella of a formal financial system. And knowledge plays a very key role here for the sustainable operation of digital finance, and it can reduce its cost, efficiency, obviously, and generate profits for the banking industry. And the other side, obviously, increase in the banking activities increases money supply within the economy, which increases the economic activities, and obviously it is a growth promoting agent. So we have done an extensive literature survey, which I'm not going to discuss now, but we have done the next slide. The literatures on we have done the literatures on financial innovation, inclusion, and socio-economic development, where we show we have got a very positive link between innovation, inclusion, and socio-economic development. Next slide. Also, we got next slide. We got information communication technology, digitalization, and socio-economic development. And finally, literature, the next literature deals with the financial inclusion, digital inclusion, and development. So these three area of empirical research we have done. Now, in the next slide, we'll discuss the research objectives. So previous literature, the empirical research points out the strong association between financial inclusion, information communication technology, and its use, which are theoretically positive, suggesting that improvement in the use of these digital services obviously stimulate financial inclusion as well as economic growth. But how far these digitalized services are inclusive, and what is the impact on this inclusive digitalization on economic growth, and the comparison with the financial innovation, the impact of financial innovation on economic growth with the inclusive digitalization on the economic growth is being done here based on the developmental status of the nations. That means we have done the analysis for lower middle income countries with the upper and upper middle income countries. So the two models are developed simultaneously and using panel framework, and the comparison is also made between this lower middle income countries with the high upper middle income countries. So before doing that, in the next, we first have what we have done that we have prepared 3 indices for the digital financial variables, one for debit card, one for credit card, and third one for the digital payments. And finally, the panel data analysis have been done using Barrow framework. So these are our research agenda. Now the data description, the data set is taken from Findex survey, financial development database, and the paper considers 121 countries where 49 lower and lower middle income countries and 72 represents high and higher upper middle income countries over the time period 2011, 14 and 17, because the Findex data is the survey data, which is available only for these 3 periods. So one limitation we have in this study, that is we cannot extend our analysis before 2011 because of the restricted data. Now next slide will discuss the variables. So for the digitalization, we have taken the proxies are taken as debit card transactions, credit card transaction, and digital payment services. And the dependent variable is obviously the GDP per capita. The growth of GDP per capita is taken as the proxy variable of economic growth, and the independent variables that are taken, these are divided into 2 parts. One is control variable and other one is digital finance variables, where we for the first part we have taken, as I have told that we have done 2 modeling here. For the first model, we have taken the financial innovation variables, where we have taken the total use of debit card, credit card, and digital payment services as proportion of total population, which is named as debit card total ownership rate, credit card ownership rate, and digital payment ownership rate. So these are the financial innovation variables. And for the inclusion, digital variables are used by many sections of the society, but we have chosen 4 classes, such as labor force, women class, poorest 40%, and the rural sections. These are the for inclusion we have chosen these 4 sections, and literatures are given also accordingly in my paper. And these 4 classes that used, and we have done the index for these 4 classes, and we named the variables as debit card societal impact index, credit card societal impact index, and digital payment societal impact index. And for the other control variables, we have used Barrow model, which I will discuss in the next paper, where Barrow says Y is function of private capital growth, the use of general government expenditure, general government final consumption expenditure, population growth, and 1 innovation variable. So accordingly, we have taken private capital deposit money banks and other financial institutions to GDP to measure financial development or financial depth of countries, general government final consumption expenditure, which is another proxy variable, population growth, and the innovation variables, financial innovation for model 1, financial innovation variable, and for model 2, inclusive digitalization variables. Now, next slide. The methodology accordingly is divided into 3 parts. As first of all, we have used the principal component analysis method to construct the index. As I've already mentioned, we have taken the 4 class, and by taking this 4 class, we have constructed the index, and the weights constructed during this preparation of the index reflects the importance of use of debit card, credit card, and digital payment variables over the years. That means from 11 to 14 to 17, which also will be discussed in the result section. The next slide. Cluster analysis. In the next slide, cluster analysis is performed. A low cluster 1 basically reflects low and middle income countries, and cluster 2 represents high and upper middle income countries, both for the use of financial innovation variables and as well as for the inclusive digitalization variables. And normalization test is performed to see whether the independent parameters are normally distributed or not. The next slide. And finally, we have used panel data framework, as it is a multiple regression framework. So we have used panel data And we have performed 2 tests, Bruce-Pagan and Hodgman test, to determine whether panel is present or not, and the appropriate model for whether it is fixed effect model or random effect model. To understand that, we have used these 2 kind of tests. So next slide. This is the panel framework. Next slide. This is our model 1, where model 1 represents this debit card ownership. Y is function of private capital, deposit, money bank. This is control variable. General government, final consumption expenditure, control variable. Population growth is another control variable. Debit card ownership, that means financial innovation variables are represented here. Debit card ownership, percentage of total population, use of total debit card out of the total population, use of credit card by all section of the society out of the total population, and made or received digital payments in the last year out of the total population. These are the innovation variables. In the next slide, we measure inclusion variables. We have incorporated the inclusion variables. The other control variables remains the same as we have used Barrow framework. And in case of the innovation variables, we have put digital debit card societal impact index, which is constructed using PCA, principal component analysis method, credit card societal impact index, and digital payment societal impact index. The next slide. So the next slide represents the weights from the PCA methods. Table 4 represents weight structure from debit card societal impact weights, which are weights are we have got this weight during this construction method from factor analysis. Second, table 5 represents credit card societal impact weights, and table 6 represents digital payment societal impact weight. So the in next slide, the weight structure, next slide, weight structure represents that debit card, for the debit card use female population and the rural. Among these 2 category, the use of debit card is gaining importance day by day, where in case of credit card, only female, among the female class, the importance of credit card is gaining importance. And for the digital payments, poor section and rural, they are gaining importance. That indicates that successful functioning of group lending functions, like in India, microfinance is very successful in India and in other nations, mostly in low and lower middle income countries, which calls for women participation and rural participation. Those who they should have a compulsory bank account in order to get this microfinance loans. So there's some kind of, they're bound to have the bank account. So the use of debit card as well as credit card is gaining importance, mostly in case of female population. And also different kinds of financial literacy camps are constructed by government of developing nations, which are adding fuel to it. And for the digital payments variables, we can see that poor section and among the rural, it is gaining importance of digital payment system, because that one reason maybe they're reluctant to use the card related facilities, like they have lack of technical knowledge, and they're still not using the debit cards, and then they're reluctant to go to the ATM machines and all that. So they are using traditional mode of transactions, banking transactions in India, like NEFT and RTGS transactions. The next slide. This is the observation I've already discussed. Next slide. So this is the panel result from the panel data analysis. So the panel data analysis shows that this is for model 1, that means financial innovation variables. One thing we have.
Trisha,
Yes.
hold on. We have a couple minutes left. Could you quickly wrap up?
Okay.
Wrap up, right, within 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. So this is the model 1, which reflects the financial innovation variables, and where we get that all the use of debit card, credit card, and digital payments doesn't have any significant impact on upper and higher middle income of countries, whereas in case of low and lower middle income countries, use of debit card shows a positive significant association, and the use of credit card got a negative, very high negative significant association with the economic growth. So we can say that the credit card use sometimes have too much debt and high interest rate charges on the use of credit card that may reduce the purchasing power and leads to negative impact on the economic growth. And next slide. In case of inclusive digitalization, the result quite same for the higher and upper middle income countries, because higher and upper middle income group of countries, it doesn't have any significant impact, whereas debit card societal impact index has a very high significant positive value with a per capita GDP growth, and credit card societal impact index has a very high significant negative impact on the per capita growth. The problem of debt remains, and from the analysis, next slide. From the analysis, we got that the value magnitude of the magnitude is higher in case of inclusive digitalization, debit card use, societal impact index with the GDP growth and the total use of debit card with the GDP growth. That means the magnitude of inclusive digitalization is much more in case of debit card use on the economic growth. So the growth has to be inclusive, so that the impact will be much more than the total use. So more inclusion will have a more positive impact on in case of only debit card. So debit card is a very key factor from our analysis which we got. So government, next slide. So government should, policymakers and government should encourage the use of debit card mode of transaction than the credit card, as credit card is negative impact. So one thing I also mentioned that in after reaching a threshold level of digital payment services, it doesn't have any impact on the upper middle income of countries. So that's all for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Tricia. Now we invite the feedback. Discussant is Toby Melissa C. Monsad, who is Professor, School of Economics, University of the Philippines. And she publishes in the areas of public economics, economics development, international economics, and housing economics, and has received the NSST Most Outstanding Book Award for her work on 3 volumes of the Philippine Human Development Report. Toby, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks, Tricia, for your presentation. I think you put a lot of work in it. I have some comments and I'll get to that later. But first, if I can just summarize for myself, I had a little difficulty picking up the key points. The way I understand it, the paper articulates 2 objectives. First, to determine whether and to what extent inclusive digitalization of financial products leads to economic growth. And second, on page 11, to ascertain whether digital innovation leads to financial inclusion or not. For objective 1, the empirical strategy is to construct an inclusive digitalization index. I'm quoting the paper, based on the percentage of use of DFS, etc., for the vulnerable sections or financial excluded sections of a country. And then use this index in a model developed in the Barrow framework to examine the impact of inclusive digitalization on per capita growth using panel data. For the second objective, the paper proposes to perform a cluster analysis on the basis of the use of overall DFS by nations and by vulnerable groups. Hence, the paper prepares a comparative analysis of overall penetration of DFS and its reach among vulnerable sections and financially excluded sections. Okay, both your objectives are relevant, and the empirical strategy for the first objective seems clear enough. However, I had some difficulty understanding how that strategy was executed and consequently what to make of the results. The empirical strategy for the second objective is far less clear, but it seems that that objective may have been dropped along the way. At least I can't find. Okay, so I think my confusion may be addressed by a more precise articulation of a conceptual framework, including definitions. For instance, how does this paper define digital financial services, and inclusive digitalization of financial products. I understand, at least the common understanding is digital financial services to be financial services accessed and delivered through digital channels. Consequently, I understand digital financial inclusion to be the digital access to and usage of formal financial services through mobile phones, smart or non-smart, and computers to access the internet. This, I take this from Sahe and others. In any case, with this definition, one can clearly distinguish digital financial inclusion and traditional financial inclusion. In contrast, the paper describes digital financial services as including ATMs, debit cards, credit cards, and so forth, and then proceeds to construct an inclusive digitalization index for the use of debit cards, the use of credit cards, along with the use of digital payments, 3 different indices. This for me is very confusing because the use of debit and credit cards may or may not be through digital channels. In fact, the percentage of adults with debit cards is typically associated with traditional financial inclusion and not digital financial inclusion. So how do you reconcile this? If the paper adopts a narrow different definition of inclusive, so let's now talk about inclusive digitalization again. I'm assuming that means digital financial inclusion, but it could be more narrow, pertaining to digital access to and usage of formal financial services, etc., by vulnerable sections, as you have highlighted. If you do this, you must explain the choice of your groups, following the World Bank global database, which your paper identifies women, adults or the poor, adults living in rural areas. But you also include the labor class, which is the labor force, which is confusing because why would adults in the labor force be considered vulnerable or financially excluded? I would think it would be those not. Actually, I don't know. Again, depending on definitions, the paper should then offer a clear theory of change, stating the channels by which greater digital financial inclusion, as distinct from traditional financial inclusion, is expected to speed up growth. And moreover, why inclusion of specific groups will matter more. So those are 2 things that have to be clearly, the channels of those 2 things must be distinguished. I'm not sure if figure 1 is supposed to do that, but figure 1 is not clear and is not explained. For objective 2, the paper needs to define digital innovation. Is this the same as fintech as popularly used? I ask because, interesting, a paper 1 in this conference, which I came across it was an IMF working paper, deals exactly with this question. Okay, questions on the research design. You use an explicit endogenous growth model developed by, which are of the Barrow type. The starting point for these models is typically, a model that includes variables describing initial conditions, and then an array of conditioning variables measuring both proximate and fundamental causes of growth. For cross-sectional analysis, we all know this is well known, that a key drawback is the problem of unobservable heterogeneity, which is partially but not totally addressed by panel estimations with country fixed effects. The paper does not discuss the choices made clearly. Why, for instance, are you not controlling for initial conditions, including initial GDP per capita and other initial conditions? Why not other conditioning variables? How is reverse causality dealt with? It is also not clear whether and to what extent diagnostics were used was heteroskedasticity or autocorrelation corrected for if they exist? Were robustness tests done? Actually, Sahe, I don't know how to pronounce his name, her or his name, and others explore the same question using the same data. And they implement an OLS model, one period in time, cross-sectional, and apply several robustness and other tests. And in fact, they use to correct for reverse causality, they use their index of financial inclusion as an initial condition, so that it's not contemporaneous with average growth over the period. I'm also curious as to why the use of a PCA to construct an inclusive digitalization index. If all you wanted was a measure of women, rural adults, and poor adults, why not extract that exactly from the microdata made available per country? Because the PCA, as we know, it's hard to interpret what that means. And there are other methods used for the indices, which are actually described in Tok and Heng, the paper 2 days ago, where they actually use digital financial indices. There are about 3 that they use. So maybe you can consider adopting the methodology of those indices if you really want to. If you pursue this.
Thank you very much for very insightful comments, but we are running out of time. Could you? Yeah.
Okay. Objective 2, the cluster analysis is I just don't understand that. Sorry. And finally, just to mention that Tok and Heng explore precisely that same question, fintech and financial. Here are other comments, which just in case, if you figure out how to settle the conceptual framework and empirical method, then I think the paper will be more easily read with these comments. Include your descriptive stats to motivate the regressions and help explain results. Provide full results of data in data annexes, including the important statistics, number of observations, etc. Your discussion of tables 4 to 6 is confusing. Principal components do not have any real meaning. The paper does not actually address sustainability, so that the title is misleading. It's just about economic growth and not about sustainability. And finally, I understand that the Findex data for 2021 microdata has just been released, and perhaps that may help because now you have a longer period. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very useful, insightful feedback. It's really great. Now I would open the floor for Q&A, but if you, Tricia, do you have any sort of response to the insights feedback from Toby?
Very good observation, but ma'am, PCA is done for the relatively common group. So these are all the vulnerable and poor section and labor class, labor class as we have taken, because among the labor class, most of them are they reflect from the unorganized sector. So they don't have the facility of getting these formal financial services. So that's why I thought to incorporate the labor class, and obviously micro level study is very helpful in this regard. So that later on I will think of it. And for the debit card, credit card, I think internet plays a key role in debit card and credit card transaction. Nowadays, we do not only go to the ATM. So debit card and credit cards are used by various merchants and online transactions. So that's why we have thought that debit card, credit card transactions are one of the major, because the mode of operation is changing, So we thought it should be incorporated as digital finance variables.
Well, thank you very much for, there is more room for discussion and clarification or exchange
Anyway,
the thoughts.
Thanks, ma'am. You have made very insightful comments.
Yeah, right.
Thank you
So,
too, Tricia. A lot of work done. Good.
well, if we don't have a question from the floor now, then time is running up. So, well, sorry that I'm gonna wrap up this paper session, but thank you very much for the paper preparation and really insightful feedback.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Both of you. Now, let's move to the last, but the least, the paper presentation. Let us move on to the paper 12, titled Gender Inclusive Development Through FinTech, Studying the Gender-Based Digital Financial Inclusion in a Cross-Country Setting. The presenter is Sabayasachi Tripathi, who teaches economics at ADBI University, Calcutta. He received postdoctorate in economics from the National Research University Higher School of Economics, Moscow, Russia. He completed his PhD in economics from the Institute of Social and Economics Change, Bangalore in 2013. And also I understand the co-authoring, as a co-author, we are going to introduce the Meenakshi Rajab, who's the and the Reserve Bank of is currently in the Reserve Bank of India chair, professor, and head of Center for Economic Studies and Policy at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, India. Am I right? I hope so. Well, the floor is yours. Whoever talk, I'm not sure. Both of you.
I will talk first.
Okay, great. For 20 minutes. Thank you.
Share the slides.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead.
Should I begin?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, a very good morning from India. Now, the title of our paper is Gender Inclusive Development Through FinTech. And the scheme of presentation, Sebastian, next slide.
Yeah.
Scheme of presentation is as follows, but I will just straight away go to the presentation. Financial inclusion for vulnerable population, especially women, about which we are concerned in this paper, is critical for achieving gender equality, women empowerment, and thereby inclusive growth in any economy. And research has shown that men actually have much better financial access than women, have more availability of credit, access to other savings facility, etc. And that because of women not having such access, it reduces their productivity. And because women constitute half of the population, therefore they also that it also reduces the welfare of the economy. Next slide. In the context of empowering women financially, leveraging this digital infrastructure is of paramount importance because the women have limited mobility due to societal constraints or familial constraints, especially in the less developed countries where this financial exclusion is a very important concern. And therefore, digital platform is very important, and it allows also women to become small entrepreneur and get economically empowered to run business. However, the experience of different countries are quite different with respect to the financial exclusion of gender-based financial exclusion. And why is it so? The first step to addressing or understanding this is to measure it. There are a large number of financial inclusion indices, but they are relatively less focused on gender, especially focusing on gender and digital index. A few indices are created, but then they have certain shortcomings, which I will come to in a moment. And therefore, it is necessary to have a comprehensive financial inclusion index, because our data analysis, which we done through the fintech data, which the previous speaker was also talking about, shows that 85% of women makes digital payment in high income countries, while it is only 19% in the low income countries. But amongst the low income countries also, there are wide variations. For example, 26% access financial services in Ethiopia, and which is as low as 1% in Afghanistan. Now, there are also other indices which talks about the gender gap in several spheres. There are established indices such as Gender Development Index, such as Gender Inequality Index. However, the link between the two, especially a comprehensive gender-based financial inclusion index and this gender development, is not much studied in the literature. Now, if we look at the literature, this brings me to the literature. If we look at the literature, a comprehensive literature is presented in the paper, but just very briefly, Fanta et al. Uses a descriptive statistics and binary logistic model and captures the effect of financial inclusion on gender, but then several components separately, savings, etc. Whereas previous slide, go back. Yeah. On the other hand, Bottrick et al., they do a decomposition and find out the gender gap for Southeastern Europe. There are IMF papers also in this conference. The first paper also talked about gender, and they are very useful and insightful papers. However, several of these scholars look at the individual components and do not provide a comparative measure over time and in an aggregative measure, which shows the disparity. Next. However, there are large number of general financial inclusion index, which are not gender-based, and they are comprehensive and across time also. And they look at the relation between the financial inclusion and human development index. Next slide. Thus, the research gaps that we identify are that gender-based indices are few and comprehensive and over time and across countries are few, looks at the financial, and then there are many indices which looks at the financial infrastructure, that is how many bank branches in a locality, and previous slide, how many bank branches in a locality, and but when we consider women, having bank branches does not necessarily mean that they are actually accessing those branches. So we give emphasis on the actual uses of these indices. And there are certain methodological shortcomings where we look at comprehensively different methodology. We present here PCA, but we also look at the same thing with respect to multidimensional poverty index and other kind of multidimensional index method also. Theoretically, when we look at this issues, there are two kind of strands of theory. One is, I can say about Banerjee, Newman, etc. Because of want of time, I have not put equations. They give a channel of true entrepreneurship as a causal mechanism for relating financial inclusion with development. And this is through entrepreneurship, financial access gives funds for investment, which gives growth. There are other theories which talks about how financial access gives human capital formation and thereby creates growth. On the other hand, there are theories which talks about the other way around kind of channel, which is starting from John Robinson into 1952, which talks about finance does not cause growth, finance responds to changing demand. And therefore, the other way around, which is talked about. Thus, however, there is not many theory which talks about gender specificity. So in this theory, therefore, we look at both demand and supply side of the problem and look at the problem from demand and supply side, and thereby we talk about from demand side, we talk about various factors such as women's education and women's access to education, income, etc. And then from the supply side, we look at infrastructure, etc. And we try to see how this infrastructure, etc. can help in accessing this credit. So the contributions of the paper is that first we measure the financial inclusion index based on a non-parametric approach where we do not assume any weights PCA method. We calculate it for 144 different countries over the period using Findex database. And this helps us to investigate how they differ across countries and within a country over time, which is very important as a country. We have seen some countries actually progressing and some countries even regressing. And then we look at actual uses of the financial services. Next slide. And next slide. And then we try to link this financial inclusion index with the gender development index and gender inequality index. And then we try to also try to see the determinants of gender-based financial inclusion index using the supply and demand side factors as discussed. And in this regard, we consider important factors such as education, income, etc. Next slide. So when we look at the country classifications, and this is just Sarbachasi will present some of the technical details, but just to give a very quick gist, is that we see the relation between the gender inequality index and financial inclusion index, where the top line is the overall financial inclusion index, which has conventional as well as digital, and the bottom line is digital, and we see the expected negative relationship. Next slide. With the gender development index, as expected, we see a positive relationship. However, in both these cases, we see large number of countries lying very much away from this mean lines, and from above and below. Next slide. And some of the countries that just quickly, because I have not been able to put all countries. If we look at India, India has, I have classified according to low, medium and high GDI and low, medium and high gender-based financial inclusion index. We can see that India is in the medium, even though it has low GDI because of some of the policies that Sarbachasi will talk about. Next slide. And however, interestingly, if you look at digital index, India is the low category. So like that, we identify the countries where we see that certain emphasis on the digital index has to be given in order to improve it. So we have constructed the index. We have constructed index for the male members and then index for the female population, and using the digital indices. And we have used these variables that use internet to pay bills, debit and credit card ownership, borrowed from a financial institution using credit card. So we use credit and debit cards because in developing countries, use of this credit and debit cards actually show the use of digital platform. Usually they go to traditional bank and line up for the services. Then we have the conventional index, which is having the usual accounts, etc. And next slide. Then we use PCA methodology. This is the way we measure for male, female by male indices, and then we come up with the gender-based financial inclusion index, conventional and digital, and combining overall financial inclusion index. Next slide. And then these are the computations of principal component analysis. Next slide. And then we arrive at these indices, and these indices values are given in the paper. And based on this, these are the top 20 countries, where New Zealand is the first country, then Norway, Canada, etc. Lowest countries are given in the next slide. And then the positive difference between some countries, previous slide, some countries show positive difference and some countries show negative difference, which are also given. The slide is actually changed. And then after arriving at this indices for over the years for different countries, we then look at what are the factors on this digital gender-based digital financial inclusion index are dependent on. And for that, we run a panel data regression. We do all the robustness test, etc. And we also do endogeneity test, and on the basis of which we use instrumental variable regression also. And then we see that income playing a very important role for the digital financial index. And then we also see the education playing an important role. Labor force participation for female also plays important role in general financial inclusion, but not in digital. Last two columns I am talking about. And then total fertility rate is positive for digital, and we feel that having higher density of population actually helps in learning by kind of seeing other females. This plays an important role. Now, bank branches play important role, important role, and then next. But the ATMs play very important.
Ma'am, I can continue.
Okay, please continue.
Ma'am, I want to continue. Can
yes, please do.
So sorry, ma'am, just internet is the problem.
Please
so
stop.
Okay, so can I share the screen, please?
The screen is already there.
So in this model, we are using two. Okay. So in this model, we are using two different kind of model. One is fixed FGLS model and IV model. That the GFII and GDFII, that one is called that gender-based index, and one is just gender-based overall index. So the two index actually our dependent variable, which we have found found values from the PCA methodology.
Okay, therefore we see that concluding that among the high income, so we identify countries where high income countries like Trinidad, Tobago, etc. has higher progress, but some countries have lower progress, which we have mentioned. This indicates the wide variation. Next slide. I'll just wrap up. And then we showed the relationship between GDI and GII, where we see expected relationship, but many countries lying above and below. And some of the regression results I have already explained. Next slide. From the first part of the regression, we see women's participation in political sphere and labor market participation has improved financial inclusion. And next slide. And for example, the different countries have taken up different policies for improving financial inclusion, and that can help. For example, in India, we have Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, which is a massive financial inclusion drive, which can show that I have shown that how financial inclusion drive has improved India's position to the middle level. And other countries, some of the other countries which are not progressing, and some of the countries even including India who are not progressing in terms of digital financial index, can actually take up important policies kind of in order to improve financial inclusion, especially focusing on women. So I stop here and I will give next slide. Yeah, I stop here because
Yeah, thank you very much. I thank you very much for your presentations. Really, we'd like to have more. I wish we could have more time, but now for the feedback, the discussant is Evanta Hashem Kasha, who has been serving as an assistant director in the Bangladesh Bank's research department. She has been engaged in preparing the central bank's annual report. Her duties consist of compiling reports on macroprudential regulations and bank supervision, analyzing banking sector's performance, and preparing periodic assessment on sustainable and inclusive banking and public finance. The floor is yours, Evanta.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you.
That's a good thing.
Let me share my slides then. Can you see it?
Yes, you have the slides.
Yeah, I am.
Slideshow thing, so we can probably have it full size. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I discuss in a cross-country setting. Look at the summary first. The objective of new gender-based financial inclusion index. The paper developed gender-based financial inclusion index using two indices, gender-based digital financial index and conventional service of digital financial inclusion. They used the data from Global Fintech Database 2017 for 3 years, 2011, 2014, and 2017, respectively. They used principal component analysis method rather than any distancing method or any non-parametric method. Developed countries ranked higher and developing countries ranked very low for female inclusion in the financial system in 2017. GFII has strong negative correlation with gender inequality index and a positive.
I think we've lost
Evanta, yeah, Evanta.
No, I think we've lost her. She's cut off.
Yeah, maybe we can go to the question in the chat box, Kigo-san.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Well, I disconnected, right? Yeah, we have a question for the presentation. Excellent work in presentation. Will it be possible to discuss how the instrumental variable has been explored? That's a question.
Okay, ma'am, I'm online back. So can I reply?
Please talk how the instrumental variable is explored.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. So basically, see, in our correlation between the dependent variable and independent variables, we found there are two variables. One is female mean years of schooling and female per capita income has a strong correlation. So these two variables, we expect that they have a problem of endogeneity, right? So we tested the endogeneity test like simple chi-square test, then Kilburgian and Puff level of significant test, all we have done. And we found that female mean years of schooling has no endogeneity problem. But another variable, that is female per capita income, has a strong instrumental problem. Therefore, we used the total per capita gross domestic product as an instrument for the variable of female per capita income, and that has passed all the tests like endogeneity test and LM state for Kilburgian and Puff, and weakness of instrumental test. All the tests we have done that we have presented in our paper, and therefore our results could be taken as a robust main variable outcome. So therefore, that female per capita income has a positive impact on the GFII, that total gross financial inclusion index.
Gender-based.
So, gender-based. So that's why in our model we don't have any kind of endogeneity problem after testing, after taking that considerations in this model.
Okay, great. It's you're back, and thank you very much for the answers. And now the Evanta is back online, I hope.
So there are indices for measuring gender inequality already. Then in most of the approaches of financial inclusion index, availability of bank branches or ATMs has been used as a major variable for measuring the index or measuring financial inclusion. But in this paper, the variables availability of bank branches or ATMs was not used. As available doesn't mean that it's being used by the population or by the customers as well. There are products, there are huge products in our market, but how many people are affording them, or how many people have the capacity to use the products?
Ivanta, probably we can look at your slides, comments, and suggestions. Thank you very much for that. And then, sorry that we would move on. Is there a question from the floor?
I did reply one comment to the.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Comment,
yeah, please,
by
please go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, actually, this bank, the bank branches and ATMs. She was asking about this bank branches and ATM. It's not available data for male-female wise. That's a problem. So that's why we cannot take that variables into our model, because the male-female wise data are not available for bank branches and ATMs. ATM availability of ATMs also. So that's the big problem.
Well, thank you very much for your comments, presentation, and also the
yes, I have done. Thank you.
Feedback that I'm sorry that Ivanta is not really having technical problem, but at least we saw her your feedback, conclusion, observation, all that. So I guess we'll see with the presentation. Hello, right? Ivanta, is that Ivanta? Well,
yes. Can you hear me?
Well, we can hear you now, but
okay. I didn't require that bank branches or ATMs are lacking in their research paper. I mentioned that it's a plus point that they didn't took that as a variable. As being accessible doesn't mean we are having the product. It's on the market, but we are not having the product. That's the plus point of the study, that they haven't used that as a major variable. If I can see my slides, please. Okay, I will try to be fast as I am having some technical problems. One of my major suggestions for them will be, please use the Findex database of 2020 available from last October. That will add more value to your paper. It will be more up to date, and it will be more countries included in your paper. If you use the global Findex database for 2021, all the variables you used in your paper are there. They are all updated, and you can use that. And the two variables you have used for indexing,
so really
I think we're gonna have to wrap up.
Yeah, wrap up, right? Yes, we're gonna wrap up. Okay. Thank you very much for all the discussions and feedback and insights. It's really, we have, even though you have technical problems, thank you very much for fruitful discussion and feedback and all that presentation. Now, now we are getting close to this end of this webinar. Next, we would have concluding remarks from John at ADBI and Dave at SMU. I would hand it back over to John. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Keigo-san, for chairing that last session. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties with a couple of the sessions with sound, just unfortunate. But I think nonetheless, we still had an excellent set of presentations during this session, and also yesterday and the day before. I think it's clearly an important topic, which is continually delivering a need for new research, given that the sector itself is moving in a rapid fashion, creating challenges for policymakers in this field, of course. So I hope we have been able to shed some light on where the gaps are and where the needs remain in order to develop digital finance in a sustainable way, which is, of course, the focus of the conference itself. We're obviously delighted to collaborate with SMU and the Sim-Ki-Boon Institute for Financial Economics. We've worked with Professor Dave Fernandez over the years on a number of different projects, and it's always great to work with them. We always have a very productive and very efficient collaboration between the two institutes. So we're obviously delighted to continue that. In terms of the next steps, I would just like to say a few words about what will happen to the papers that were presented over the past few days. So as you may be aware, myself and Professor Dave are guest editing a special issue of the Sustainability Journal. So we will be looking closely at the papers that were presented over the days, and we will be sending information to the authors who we will recommend to submit to the journal. There will be other publication opportunities for the other papers as well. So please keep an eye out for the details next week on that. So finally, just on behalf of ADBI, thank you very much once again. And I will now hand over to Dave for some remarks on his side. Dave?
Thank you very much, John. And just want to echo a lot of the things that John said. I mean, just stepping back, going back to the call for papers and the motivation for doing this in the first place. These are both very important areas, digital finance and sustainability, when it comes to the broader societal picture of what the dynamics are, what's happening in the world, and what the most pressing issues in the world are. And the idea here in calling you all together, and we were so impressed by the enthusiasm of the submissions, and for those of you who selected the thoroughness of your presentations and the quality of the discussions that happened after, because this is a new area, it's an emerging area, and it's one that we hoped by calling you together for this conference that we could help to push the academic agenda forward. And in particular, for both our institutions, for the Asian Development Bank Institute and for SMU and the Sim-Ki-Boon Institute, with an eye toward Asia, the research to the degree possible in application toward our region. And so I think that has been accomplished over these 3 days. As John has noted, there's still more work to do, and as there always is. But I think that we should all feel good about the work that's gone in so far. I also want to take note of the keynote addresses that we had throughout these 3 days. For those of you who stayed up late, depending on your time zone, to watch the Nobel Prize lectures that were given last night by the three economists who shared the prize. Our first keynote speaker, Professor Manju Puri, was actually mentioned in one of those as someone whose work is making grounded in reality and making theoretical models more realistic. And I think that's a theme for us as well, that we want to make sure that the research is grounded in the real world, especially here in our region in Asia. And I think, again, that's a goal that we did help to accomplish in this emerging field. So congratulations to everyone who participated. Thanks very much for your active discussions. And we look forward to future collaborations in the coming year.